So we want to say a very big thank you to TULCA, to Michele Horrigan, our curator, and to David Finn and to Lucy for including us in this year's edition, to the Galway Museum for housing our show downstairs, and to the ATU for hosting the talk, and to the University of Galway Centre for Creative Technologies and the Galway Culture Company as well for funding our trip to to North America, to the US last month, and to the Arts Council for supporting our work this year. So we are delighted to, I'm going to read because we've got a lot to tell you. We are delighted to have this opportunity to present some of our research and the thinking behind a collection of disarticulated bones on show as part of TULCA here, and it's actually on until the 31st of December. It runs a bit longer than TULCA if you want to tell your friends. We are collaborative artists based in Sligo and Leitrim, like Gavin said. I'm Ruth. And this is Niamh. So our current work examines official and folk narratives of progress and nostalgia, complacency and solidarity, romance and pragmatism as part of an ongoing search for moments of unrealised potential in history. A dialogue between these ideas is enacted through our collaborative process, often taking the form of conversational storytelling. Much of our work over the years has begun with a very long walk or pilgrimage, which functions as an important time and space for us to move very slowly through the landscape and to collect our thoughts.
The idea of a pilgrimage, that is a journey into the unknown leading to a personal moment of transformation, relates to the work we've been making about historical migration from Ireland to so-called America, in which people fleeing domestic hardship created by British policies settled across the Atlantic and often became oppressors themselves. We're interested in the idealised version of Ireland that has been constructed by Irish Americans, internalised by Irish people, and then often sold back to Irish American visitors through our heritage and tourism industries. We think about the fantasy of return home across the sea, in which people making touristic pilgrimages to their homeland make touristic pilgrimages to their homeland, and then the impossibility of going back to a place for the very first time. This close relationship between Ireland and the United States has had far-reaching consequences, from Irish settlers' role in the genocide of Indigenous people and the destruction of their lands, to the role of Irish Americans in the institution of slavery and the modern-day police state, to our ongoing cooperation at home with the US military, who since 1990 have used Shannon Airport to land and refuel planes carrying weapons, cargo and prisoners. As uncovered by independent journalists at the Ditch this year, this US cargo is directly implicated in the ongoing genocide of Palestinian people in Gaza and the destruction by the State of Israel of all forms of life in Palestine, including fertile lands, heritage sites, hospitals, schools, universities and homes. Here is the 46th and current President of the United States, Joe Biden, receiving a commemorative brick on his visit to his ancestral home of Ballina in County Mayo. While there, Biden reflected on the success of the peace process in Northern Ireland and proclaimed that County Mayo was now a part of his soul.
So to return to this idea of nation building or statecraft through mythology, imagery and collectibles, this 1925 painting by Paul Henry was published as part of an ad campaign by the London, Midland and Scottish Railway and is a typical example of Irish tourist imagery. Perfect cottages in unspoiled landscapes, untouched as yet by modernity. Henry's posters were bestsellers in his lifetime, adorning Irish homes and public spaces for decades. These romantic paintings have roots in the colonial imaginings of Ireland, romantic visions of unspoiled landscapes and equally unspoiled inhabitants. These pictures speak to anxieties around the construction of an authentic Irish identity, both at home in Northern Ireland and in emigrant communities abroad. So last year, we pilgrimaged to the Ulster American Folk Park in Northern Ireland, perhaps in search of personal transformation brought through confronting an uncomfortable past. The Folk Park is a depository for hyper-local as well as transatlantic histories, as it is populated both by period homes from a pre- and post-famine era Ireland and antebellum America. After navigating the Irish side of the park, visitors board a ship and arrive in the New World on the other side. The Folk Park is still in the process of acknowledging the histories of the Indigenous peoples displaced by immigrants from Western Europe. So they're currently updating all their signage and everything. One particularly formidable house was first built in Sumner County, Tennessee in around 1825 by a first-generation Catholic Irish settler, and then relocated brick by brick to the New World part of the park. The home tells a very compelling story of Irish assimilation, as the Horrigan family who settled there were Ulster Catholics who gained a fortune in the tobacco trade, owed to one of the largest slave plantations in Tennessee at the time. You can actually see they've planted tobacco plants there. As the polls close today on the 2024 presidential election, it's relevant to note that Democratic presidential candidate Kamala Harris is connected to Ireland through less favourable circumstances than her counterpart Biden. The Jamaican side of her family, according to her father, is descended from a white enslaver named Hamilton Brown, who was born in Antrim in 1776. He emigrated to the then British colony of Jamaica, where he ran sugar plantations, owned scores of enslaved people, and likely fathered children among them. The Horrigan House offers a glimpse into adverse museum experience where Irish American tourists could find unexpected roots.
So while at the Ulster American Folk Park, we spoke to a building conservator who demonstrated the process of numbering the materials. So you can see on this brick wall, there was plastic number plates on each brick, which didn't come off when the building was reconstructed, but it kind of gives it this uncanny aspect. So he demonstrated the process of numbering each material that make up a home and deconstructing them brick by brick and timber beam by timber beam until you're left with a pile of stuff. Downstairs, there's a short film where Niamh Moriarty, who's the Folk Park and Museum's curator of emigration, recounts the story of the Irish emigrant Hugh Horrigan, his journey to America and his family's exploits there. So this is the house that his son built in sort of the style of like British colonists that came over who would have had these brick houses at home where there was brick factories. It's a much more labour intensive process to build a sort of like status symbol house of bricks in like a rural landscape where the material has to be dug from the riverbed and like pressed by hand and laid out in the sun. So it's very much about status building a house like this where they settled in Tennessee. So we're interested in the moment of transformation when the house isn't a house but a hoard of objects suspended in space. We picture these bricks unfurling, spinning in a great circle and coagulating again as the stately dwelling house, suspended in time, but now where it is in Oma, dislocated in space. The house is built and rebuilt in each moment of encounter. Visitors, including ourselves, struggle to reconcile what happened in this house within the landscape that it's now sitting in, so on the island of Ireland. When the conservators were rebuilding this house in Ireland in 2008, they noticed that some of the bricks had errors, handprints, dents and markings from children and animals who would have been present when the clay bricks were drying outside. It's important to note that the Horrigan family didn't have any children of their own on the plantation at the time when the house was built, so it's very safe to assume that this was the child of an enslaved family. So the bricks were taken out of the building and replaced with new bricks for further study and preservation. So they saw them as something interesting and unique, but they weren't yet on display. So today we're sharing 2 bricks as digital replicas. These are they. They're a little bit scaled down, so you have to imagine them being brick-sized. It's just the size of the digital printer we printed them on. These were scanned by the National Museums of Northern Ireland and generously 3D printed here at the library at Galway University. We want to use these museum objects as educational tools that could be held and touched, and in this way given the respect of relics. So please handle them and consider them as they move around the room. 1 brick holds a handprint and 1 a bare footprint, both likely belonging to a child living on the plantation 200 years ago. Taking these pieces out of the wall seems to disrupt the logic of its archaeological brick by brick reconstruction. So the house itself becomes like an artwork housed inside a museum. It's no longer a functioning home, with its anthropological purpose destabilised by the removal and replacement of these particular bricks. Last summer, we exhibited the 2 original Horrigan House bricks alongside key romantic paintings by artists who were active during Ireland's revolutionary period and formative early years of the Free State, so including the Paul Henry poster that you saw earlier. We were presenting those paintings as a sort of promise to an emerging nation, alongside contemporary video works by artists working in Ireland and North America that give prominence to more recent depictions of the ecological realities of partisan violence and enduring colonial gaze that affected so-called Western landscapes in the ensuing years. We used the 3D bricks to make moulds from which we made plaster casts, which are in the exhibition downstairs. They're in a vitrine. The plaster cast bricks follow the tradition of museums making and distributing copies of classical sculptures as educational tools and museum display objects. We created the replica bricks as a gesture of respect to the unknown maker of the original bricks and the child who left their mark in them, treating them as important artistic and historic objects. Furthermore, the original bricks are now on permanent physical display at the Ulster American Folk Park, being given attention by a wider public. So we're interested in how the inevitable loss of information through the process of scanning, printing, moulding and recasting can allude to the gaps in our understanding as a result of temporal distance between objects, people, places and stories such as this one.
So somewhere in suburban Dublin, there is a brick wall with a circular hole shrouded by no trespass signs and tall fences, which over a decade ago now, we set out to capture on video using a homemade wooden spit device to rotate the camera for the entire duration of a mini DV tape, if anybody remembers mini DV. I won't make you listen to any more of that. So there is a history being inscribed onto the surface of the tape. If the tape loop were cut and stretched out straight, then the wall would fall down. Each turn is different from the last. The camera spit might have become stuck, or our hands have gotten colder, or we've unconsciously sped up in order to try and make the 63 minutes go faster. We imagine then that the wall and the tapes are side by side, but veering towards one another. They meet for a moment before the tape rolls up and the wall bends away. This little touch repeats at every single moment, and every moment is a new start. The wall is translated onto tape, and now it only exists there. The word translation can mean to render into another language, to express into another artistic medium, to interpret the significance or meaning of an action or behaviour, for example, to remove or transfer to another place, to remove to heaven, especially without death. So saints were translated into heaven, meaning that their bodies did not suffer the decay of mortal beings. With each rotation, another layer peels off the wall until it is translated entirely out of the world.
Translation in Christian tradition since antiquity also refers to the removing of remains or relics of a saint's body from one place to another, often with a public procession or vigil going with it. We imagine the relics containing ideas of flow, both of people and power. The systems for classifying relics establishes that a first-class relic is an actual piece of the saintly body. A second class is something that's used by the saint while they're in that body, such as clothing. A third class is something that has touched the body, so that can be anything. And a fourth class is something that has been rubbed against a second-class relic. So there's a lot of scope for that. Power flows from the saint to another material and onward, eventually to the faithful person touching the relic. Medieval reliquaries, containers of relics, would have travelled along pre-established global trade routes, describing the movement of people as well as of pilgrims, acting almost like early souvenirs. So the word relic itself contains both the act of leaving and that which is left behind. So in English, relic comes from the Latin relique, meaning remains, coming from relinquo, meaning I leave behind, I abandon, or I relinquish. They're objects which become an interface between the human and the supernatural, whose power is given to them by the stories that are told about them. So these steps in Barcelona, this step, for example, these steps are a popular tourist site because they claim to be where Christopher Columbus was received by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella after his voyage to the so-called New World. So lots of people step on these steps and imagine that they're walking in the footsteps of so-called greatness. And then it's relevant here because there's the Christopher Columbus memorial monument outside, just beyond the Spanish Arch, though that was never touched by the man himself.
So 10 years ago, we were asked to respond to poet, musician and performance and Fluxus non-artist Tomas St. Turba's Czechoslovak Radio 1968 in Belfast. A year and a half after the artwork appeared in Documenta 13, which, if anyone doesn't know, is a large-scale exhibition that happens every 5 years in Kassel in Germany. Czechoslovak Radio 1968 consists of a red building brick with chalk markings drawn onto sides denoting the dials of a radio. When Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Soviet army in 1968, people resisted through creative means. So after they were forbidden to listen to radio broadcasts, they started attaching antennas to the bricks as a sign of protest. These fake radios spread amongst the population who pretended to listen to them, and although they were useless as a communication device, they were continuously confiscated by the Russian army, which weighed down their bags. The earnest attention directed by the citizens of Prague towards the brick radios they made, according to Tomas St. Turba's instruction, cover a brick in newspaper and listen to it on the street, bestowed these mute devices with powerful recalcitrants as protest objects, their withdrawn silence becoming like a shared code amongst listeners. However, the radio brick is a potent entity independently of this energy invested in it. It seems to hover between two states, not quite brick and not quite radio. Sometimes an ex-brick turned radio, and sometimes a brick, which once decommissioned, has only a dim memory of being a radio. Its sulphurous markings, the only trace of its former existence. This mysterious dimension reflects perhaps the strange space opened up by metaphor and illusion in which things bump into each other, hinting at their remote realities. The shuttling back and forth between brick, radio, and radio brick causes it to become ontologically destabilized as well as estranged from the world and itself.
So, our response to this. In Belfast, we experimented in raising both conscious and subconscious awareness of the brick radio's presence in Belfast. We did this by leaving flyers in library books, faxing invitations to the very few fax machines left in town, and pinning up notices in notice boards in the local shopping centre. We also ran an internet radio station which explored our research into the brick radio through readings, noise music, storytelling, Baltic Revolution, folk pop songs, as well as archival recordings. Research material was presented by a range of voices from north and south of the border. The work culminated in what we called the Czechoslovak Radio 1968 fan club meeting and pilgrimage, which took place on a very dark and foggy Valentine's Day on Belfast's Black Mountain. So huddled under a heavy piece of black felt on the side of a decommissioned British Army listening post. The interesting thing was we wanted to be able to see the listening post, but actually you had to just believe it was there because you couldn't see a thing, and there was no view of Belfast either. So it was like a fog or like radio noise descended on the pilgrimage that we had. So as an artwork, the brick radio demonstrates a moment in which, through the contemplation of an object, the world becomes unfamiliar, somehow resistant, and yet emitting enough faint noise to keep us listening.
The Giant's Causeway, if you don't know, is approximately 40,000 interlocking basalt columns, the result of an ancient volcanic fissure eruption. It's located in County Antrim on the north coast of Ireland. According to legend or its own geomyth, the Irish giant Finn McCool was challenged to a fight by the Scottish giant Benandonner, which he accepted and built the causeway across the North Channel so that the two could meet. Across the sea, there are identical basalt columns in Fingal's Cave in the Scottish Isle of Staffa. It's amongst the most popular tourist attractions in Northern Ireland, receiving roughly 1 million visitors a year. The National Trust manages the site, but the Crown Estate is the legal owner of all lands between high and low watermark and has rights over the seabed within its territorial waters. There's a reconstruction or potential piece of the Giant's Causeway at an Asda Superstore car park in Coleraine, just 20 minutes from the UNESCO World Heritage Site where these rocks were likely taken from. There is a piece of the Giant's Causeway at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum, presented to the President from the people of Antrim upon his famed visit in 1963 to Ireland.
So a basalt column section from the Giant's Causeway fetched just €580 at a White's auction in 2013. But there's two sizable columns from the Giant's Causeway. We don't know how big. Housed in the British Museum. This year we've been in conversation with them, searching for these columns. The story goes that they were moved at some point to the Natural History Museum at some time since 1809, when they're mentioned in a synopsis of the contents of the British Museum. So far, the curators and conservators there have not been able to locate these giants. There is theory that while the Natural Heritage Collection was being migrated to the Natural History Museum, the basalt columns have been mistaken for building materials. So they would have been on either side of the doorway of the original British Museum, of the original Grand Hall there. Because their shape is so perfect, that's how they maybe were mistaken for building materials. So they could be in storage with other old man-made columns, stone slabs or bricks.
So thank you so much for coming to this talk about bricks. We invite you to go and look at the show downstairs, and if you haven't had a chance to, and we'll stick around for any conversation or questions.
Yes.
After the